This week, we visit the idea. This week, we visit the idea of critical theories in library and information studies and sciences. We explore some of the key terminology and look at how LIS is currently applying these ideas in the field. I want to look at different approaches to applying critical theories in LIS, including challenging neutrality, talking about structural discrimination, some various terminology in critical theories that are relevant to LIS, and approaches of social construction and the applications within the library spaces and services. Looking to the future of library and information science, I want us to consider one larger trend that has gained momentum in recent years among librarians, scholars, and information professionals. Recently, the turn back towards critical theories has increasingly found its way in library and information science. Instead of approaching information theories and services with this idea of the neutral librarian, critical theorists within LIS advocate against this false idea of neutrality. Rather, they advocate that LIS take an active position of advocacy and activism for intersectional identities. Let's break a few of these terms down before we go further. So let's look at these ideas of neutrality, intersectionality, and critical approaches. This critical approach allows for the LIS academic and professional to look at the systems of hegemony or hierarchies and how they influence the ways in which we organize information, library spaces, LIS programming, and collections, to name a few. Critical information studies investigates dynamics in this field and specifically different debates. So they look at the relationship among information control, property rights, technologies and social norms, and the cultural, political, social, and economic ramifications of these global flows of culture and information. Now, LIS has a long history of attempting this idea of neutrality in the name of information science, attempting to provide unbiased and objective approaches to information. However, academic Todd Hanma and library historian Christine Pauli resist these ideas of neutrality. The library spaces has historically applied Western ideals into the library system through such programming as immigrant naturalization in English learning, and primarily young adult collections that only represent white children, and even into the systems of classification that don't allow for multiple gender identities. So these information spaces are not neutral or value-free, but they are often replicas or new forms of old hierarchies. They are built in politics around identities, around race, gender, sexuality, class, ability, and disability. So then we come to this term of intersectionality, which is important for this new wave of critical theories in LIS. Intersectionality is an approach to critical theories that allows for multiple identifiers and lenses to be applied to information science. Intersectionality, as defined by Black feminist theorist Patricia Hill Collins, describes the interlocking oppressions of race, gender, and class. Some other considerations in intersectionality are ability and disability, age, nationality, indigeneity, and language. So, with this approach of critical theories, LIS practitioners have resisted the language of diversity and multiculturalism, or at least challenged it, and instead have labeled these as languages or words that stand in the way of discussing race and racism in LIS. Historically, diversity and multiculturalism has overshadowed these discussions around racism within library spaces. So, with this approach of critical information theory, we see that LIS functions in a race blind vacuum, and questions need to be raised surrounding racial blindness in LIS, challenging the field's use of words such as multiculturalism and diversity. With this sort of unveiling of racism and resisting multiculturalism and diversity, we see silence and invisibility around whiteness, even in the library spaces. So, silence around whiteness sort of lets everyone continue to harbor prejudices and misconceptions, beginning with this notion that white equals normal, and whiteness oppresses when it operates as an invisible regime of normality, and it makes whiteness visible. Making whiteness visible is a principal goal of anti-racist pedagogy. So, studying whiteness or whiteness studies means studying institutional racism, especially practices that create white privilege. Since white privilege is systematic and not personal, this approach can combat the tendency to get stuck in the white guilt syndrome and allows us to see the framework in which ideas and technologies proliferate. So, studying whiteness can change the dynamic of any discussion about library practices by moving the conversation from personal attitudes to an analysis of historical events, legal codes, social institutions, and cultural practices in which information professions impact and shape. So, what is whiteness studies? This looks at the cultural and social construction of whiteness and white privilege. Academics such as Noel Ignatieff, who wrote this book called How the White Became Irish, or How the Irish Became White, find that whiteness is socially constructed over time, right? So some groups don't start as white, such as the Irish and the Italian, and that whiteness has a material value and works as a property. So let's talk about this idea of institutional racism. So, what is institutional racism? Well, it is embedded into systems. So, it's not about personal feelings, though there's this relationship between personal feelings and institutional practices. But really, what we find is institutional racism is embedded into America's institutions, such as education, housing, the law. So, at an institutional level, we have seen major movements that have tried to use tools like legislation or the political sphere to disrupt the power that has been legally conferred upon people with white or lighter skin, and instead to create social equality. One interesting example of institutional racism is this work by C.K. Malone on Houston's colored Carnegie Library in the early 1900s. So Houston's African American activists turned a Jim Crow South segregated library into basically an opportunity for autonomy. So staff and basically black patrons were turned away from the original Houston Carnegie Library, and African Americans in that area instead created a black established and run library out of this institutional racism. So what we find is that out of institutional racism, librarians and patrons from African American communities created their own autonomous spaces that really empowered the Black community. There's also this idea of individual racism or microaggressions. Microaggressions is a theory of specific interaction between those of different cultures, and it's a non-physical aggression, so it involves demeaning implications and other subtle insults. Microaggressions has been defined as brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicates hostile, derogatory, or negative racial insights and insults towards people of color. So there's three types of these microaggressions that researchers have found. And this research was conducted by Chester and Pierce in the 1970s. First, there's microassaults, a conscious and intentional action or slur, verbal or nonverbal behavior aimed at hurting a person, such as using racial slurs or epithets. There's micro insults, verbal and nonverbal communications that subtly convey rudeness and insensitivity and demean a person's racial heritage or identity. And there's micro invalidations, communications that subtly exclude, minimize, negate, or nullify the thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of a person of color. So, for instance, this research found that people often ask Asian Americans where they were born as if they were not able to be from the United States. So, one way that LIS is exploring this is through a blog called Microaggressions in LIS, where people sort of anonymously post the microaggressions they've experienced in library spaces. Next, we have this term, socially constructed. So, what is socially constructed is a term that comes out of sociology, and we can apply it to this idea around race and whiteness. So, whiteness is sort of socially constructed to be a symbol of power. And we can also look at socially constructed as a way that it shapes the information technologies and just the practices of everyday library spaces. So, social construction of technology theories are originally developed by Langdon Winner in the 1980s, who analyzed and realized technology as a political and social construct, noting that technology is embedded and created with its surrounding practices and dynamics of power. So, Winner found that technological things have political qualities. And again, we resist this idea of neutrality. So, technology is not neutral, but in fact, it can have political implications. So, how are librarians contributing and applying these critical conversations? Here are some examples. One, there's this group called FemTechNet, and it's a network of scholars, students, and artists working in technology, science, and feminism in various fields. This network does a lot of different types of media, but one of the key projects that many LIS students are involved in is their project Storming Wikipedia. Wikistorming works to train more women as editors of Wikipedia, and library science students are involved in these Wikistorming projects. Next, we have hashtag CritLib. This is short for Critical Librarianship, a movement of librarian workers who discuss social justice principles in their work in libraries. Hashtag CritLib happens on Twitter around various topics. We also saw these applications in the Ferguson libraries in 2014 with the shooting of Michael Brown by police officer Darren Wilson. There were many protests taking place in Ferguson, Missouri, and the Ferguson Public Library made a public statement by staying open during the protests and clashes with police. This message was spread widely through Twitter, and the director of the Ferguson Public Library, Scott Bonner, even did a Reddit Ask Me Anything in November 2014. So there's a lot of interest around this sort of library activism. And finally, or next, we have the Dartmouth librarians and students who together challenged the Library of Congress subject headings with the word illegal alien. So these librarians and students have been working on challenging this LCSH, and this is going through a process of appeals through Library of Congress. And next, we have the Kansas University Libraries, who offer these pins, sort of to destabilize gender and to get people's gender pronouns correct. So you can choose a pin when you go into the library that sort of states your preferred gender. These are just a few examples of how LIS professionals, students, and faculty are already involved in applying these terms that I've reviewed. So we have this idea of critical information studies, social justice issues, intersectionality, neutrality, and all of these ideas come into play in the library.